Aaron began to take a closer look at institutions that publish academic journal articles.
By virtue of being students at a major U.S. university, I assume that you have access to a wide variety of scholarly journals. Pretty much every major university in the United States pays these sort of licensing fees to organizations like JSTOR and Thomson and ISI to get access to scholarly journals that the rest of the world can't read.
These scholarly journals and articles are essentially the entire wealth of human knowledge online, and many have been paid for with taxpayer money or with government grants. But to read them, you often have to pay again, handing over steep fees to publishers like Reed Elsevier.
These licensing fees are so substantial that people who are studying in India instead of studying in the United States don't have this kind of access. They're locked out from all of these journals. They're locked out from our entire scientific legacy. I mean, a lot of these journal articles, they go back to the Enlightenment. Every time someone has written down a scientific paper, it's been scanned and digitized and put in these collections. That is a legacy that has been brought to us by the history of people doing interesting work, the history of scientists. It's a legacy that should belong to us as a commons, as a people, but instead it's been locked up and put online by a handful of for-profit corporations who then try and get the maximum profit they can out of it.
So a researcher paid by the university or the people publishes a paper, and in the very, very last step of that process, after all the work is done, after all the original research is done, the thinking, the lab work, the analysis, after everything is done at that last stage, then the researcher has to hand over his or her copyright to this multi-billion-dollar company. And it's sick. It's an entire economy built on volunteer labor. And then the publishers sit at the very top and scrape off the cream.
Talk about a scam. One publisher in Britain made a profit of $3 billion last year. I mean, what a racket.
JSTOR is just a very, very small player in that story, but for some reason, JSTOR is the player that Aaron decided to confront.
He'd gone to some conference around open access and open publishing, and I don't know who the person from JSTOR was, but I think at some point Aaron asked the question, like, how much would it cost to open up JSTOR in perpetuity? And they gave some, I think it was $200 million, something that Aaron thought was totally ridiculous.
Working on a fellowship at Harvard, he knew users on MIT's famously open and fast network Nextdoor had authorized access to the riches of JSTOR. Swartz saw an opportunity.
You have a key to those gates. And with a little bit of shell script magic, you can get those journal articles.
On September 24th, 2010, Swartz registered a newly purchased Acer laptop on the MIT network under the name Gary Host. The client name was registered as Ghost Laptop.
He doesn't hack JSTOR in the traditional sense of hacking. The JSTOR database was organized, so it was completely trivial to figure out how you could download all the articles in JSTOR because it was basically numbered. It was basically, / number article 444,024. Then 25, then 26.
He wrote a Python script called keepgrabbing.py, which was like keep grabbing one article after another.
The next day, Ghost Laptop begins grabbing articles, but soon the computer's IP address is blocked. For Swartz, it's barely a bump in the road. He quickly reassigns his computer's IP address and keeps downloading.
Well, JSTOR and MIT take a number of steps to try to interfere with this when they notice that this is happening. And when the more modest steps don't work, then at a certain stage, JSTOR just cuts off MIT from having access to the JSTOR database. So there's this kind of cat and mouse game around getting access to the JSTOR database. Aaron ultimately, obviously, is the cat because he has more technical capability than the JSTOR database people do in defending them.
And eventually, there was an unlocked supply closet in the basement of one of the buildings. And he went, instead of going through Wi-Fi, he went down there and he just plugged his computer directly into the network and just left it there with an external hard drive downloading these articles to the computer.
Unknown to Swartz, his laptop and hard drive had been found by authorities. They didn't stop the downloads. Instead, they installed a surveillance camera.
They found the computer in this room in the basement of an MIT building. They could have unplugged it. They could have waited for the guy to come back and said, dude, what are you doing? You know, cut it out. Who are you? And they could have done all that kind of stuff, but they didn't. What they wanted to do was film it to gather evidence to make a case. That's the only reason you film something like that.
At first, the only person caught on the glitchy surveillance camera was using the closet as a place to store bottles and cans. But days later, it caught Swartz. Swartz is replacing a hard drive. He takes it out of his backpack, leans out of frame for about 5 minutes, and then leaves.
And then they organized a stakeout where, as he was biking home from MIT, these cops came out from either side of the road or something like that and started going after him.
He describes that he was pressed down and assaulted by the police. He tells me that it's unclear that they were police that were after him. He thought that someone was trying to attack him. He does tell me they beat him up. I was just devastated. The notion of any kind of criminal prosecution of anyone in our family or anything was so foreign and incomprehensible, I didn't know what to do.
Well, they execute search warrants at Aaron's house, his apartment in Cambridge, and his office at Harvard.
2 days before the arrest, the investigation had gone beyond JSTOR and the local Cambridge police. It had been taken over by the United States Secret Service. The Secret Service began investigating computer and credit card fraud in 1984, but 6 weeks after the attack on 9/11, their role expanded. President Bush used the Patriot Act to establish a network of what they called electronic crimes task forces.
The bill before me takes account of the new realities and dangers posed by modern terrorists.
According to the Secret Service, they are primarily engaged in activity with economic impact, organized criminal groups, or use of schemes involving new technology. The Secret Service turned Swartz's case over to the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office.
There was a guy in the U.S. Attorney's Office who had the title head of the Computer Crimes Division or Task Force. I don't know what else he had going, but you're certainly not much of a computer crimes prosecutor without a computer crime to prosecute. So he jumped on it, kept it for himself, didn't assign it to someone else within the office or the unit, and that's Steve Hyman.
Prosecutor Stephen Hyman has been largely out of public view since the arrest of Aaron Swartz, but he can be seen here in an episode of the television show American Greed, filmed around the time of Aaron's arrest. He is describing his previous case against the notorious hacker Alberto Gonzalez, a case that garnered Hyman enormous press attention and accolades. Gonzalez masterminded the theft of over 100 million credit card and ATM numbers, the largest such fraud in history. Here, Hyman, describing Gonzalez, gives his view on the hacker mindset.
These guys are driven by a lot of the same things that we're driven by. They have an ego, they like challenge, and of course they like money and everything you can get from money.
One of the suspects implicated in the Gonzalez case was a young hacker named Jonathan James. Believing Gonzalez's crimes would be pinned on him, James committed suicide during the investigation. In an early press release describing the government's position in the case of Aaron Swartz, Hyman's boss, U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts Carmen Ortiz, said this: "Stealing is stealing, whether you use a computer command or a crowbar, and whether you take documents, data, or dollars."
It's not true. It's obviously not true. I'm not saying it's harmless, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't criminalize stealing of information, but you've got to be much more subtle in trying to figure out exactly which kinds of harms are harmful here. So the thing about a crowbar is every time I break into a place with a crowbar, I do damage. There's no doubt about it. But when Aaron writes a script that says download, download, download 100 times in a second, there's no obvious damage to anybody. If he does that for the purpose of gathering an archive to do academic research on it, there is never any damage to anybody.
He wasn't stealing, he wasn't selling what he got or giving it away. He was making a point, as far as I could tell.
The arrest took its toll on Swartz.
He just wouldn't talk about it. And he's like very stressed. If you thought like the FBI was like going to come to your doorstep any day, anytime you went down the hall, even to do your laundry, and they would break into your apartment because you left the door unlocked, like, I'd be pretty stressed. And it was clear. And so Aaron was always sort of like in like a dour mood. He wouldn't give off any sensitive information about his whereabouts during this time because he was so afraid that the FBI would be waiting for him.
It was a time of unprecedented social and political activism. Time magazine would later name as their 2011 Person of the Year, the protester.
There was a kind of hotbed of hacker activity going on. WikiLeaks had released a trove of diplomatic cables. Manning had been under arrest at the time. It was unknown whether he was the source of the leak. Anonymous, which is a kind of protest ensemble that has a lot of hackers in its ranks, were going on various sprees of sorts. If you compare that to what he did, his stuff should have been left behind for MIT and JSTOR to deal with in a kind of private, professional manner. It should have never gotten the attention of the criminal system. It just didn't belong there.
Before he was indicted, Swartz was offered a plea deal that involved 3 months in prison, time in a halfway house, and a year of home detention, all without the use of a computer. It was on the condition that Swartz plead guilty to a felony.
Here we are. We have no discovery, no evidence whatsoever about what the government's case is, and we have to make this immense decision where the lawyer is pushing you to do this, the government is giving you a non-negotiable demand, and you're told that your likelihood of prevailing is small, so whether you're guilty or not, you're better off taking the deal.
Boston has its own computer crimes division, with lots of lawyers, probably more lawyers than they need. So, you can imagine all sorts of cases where it'd be really hard to prosecute because you've got some criminals in Russia, or you've got some people inside of a corporation that are going to have $500 lawyers or $700 an hour lawyers sitting down against you. And then you've got this case with this kid, which is pretty easy to prove that he did something, and he's already marked himself as a troublemaker with the FBI, so why not go as tough as you can in here against that guy? It's good for you, the prosecutor. It's good for the Republic because you're fighting all those terrorist types.
I was so scared. I was so scared of having my computer seized. I was so scared of going to jail because of my computer being seized. I had confidential material from sources from my previous work on my laptop. And that is above all my priority, is to keep my sources safe. I was so scared of what was going to happen to Ada. Aaron told me that they'd offered him a deal, and he finally just said that he would take it if I told him to. And I came real close to saying take it. He had developed like serious political aspirations in the intervening time between when, that moment when he ended that entrepreneurial startup life and begun this new life that had come to this political activism. And he just didn't believe that he could continue in his life with a felony. He said to me one day, we were walking by the White House, and he said to me, they don't let felons work there. And, you know, he really wanted that to be his life.
He hadn't killed anybody. He hadn't hurt anybody. He hadn't, like, stolen money. He hadn't done anything that seemed felony worthy, right? And there is this idea that, like, there's no reason that he should be labeled a felon and taken away his right to vote in many states for doing what he did. Like, that's just outrageous. Like, it makes sense for him to be, you know, maybe fined a bunch of money or, you know, asked not to come back to MIT again. But, like, to be a felon, to face jail time.
Swartz turned down the plea deal.
Hyman redoubled his efforts. Hyman continued to press us at all levels.
Even with the physical evidence seized from Aaron's Acer computer, hard drive, and USB drive, the prosecutors needed evidence of his motives. Why was Aaron Swartz downloading articles from JSTOR, and just what did he plan to do with them?
The government claims that he was planning to publish these. We don't really know whether that was his real intention, because Aaron also had a history of doing projects where he'd analyze giant data sets of articles in order to learn interesting things about them.
The best evidence for that was that when he was at Stanford, he also had downloaded the whole Westlaw legal database.
In a project with Stanford law students, Swartz had downloaded the Westlaw legal database. He uncovered troubling connections between funders of legal research and favorable results.
He did this amazing analysis of for-profit companies giving money to law professors who wrote law review articles which were then beneficial to, like, Exxon during an oil spill, right? So it was a very corrupt system of funding, you know, vanity research.
Swartz had never released the Westlaw documents.
In theory, he could have been doing the same thing about the JSTOR database. That would have been completely okay. If he were, on the other hand, intending to create a competitive service to JSTOR, like we're going to set up our own, you know, access to the Harvard Law Review and charge, you know, money for it, then, you know, okay, now it seems like criminal violation because you're commercially trying to exploit this material, but it's kind of crazy to imagine that's what he was doing. So, but then there's the middle case. Well, what if he was just trying to liberate it for all of the developing world? But depending on what he was doing, it creates a very different character to how the law should be thinking about it. The government was prosecuting him as if this was like a commercial criminal violation, like stealing a whole bunch of credit card records. It was that kind of crime.
I don't know what he was going to do with that database, but I heard from a friend of his that Aaron had told him he was going to analyze the data for evidence of corporate funding of climate change research that led to biased results. And I totally believe that.
I was just told that Steve wanted to talk to me. And I thought, maybe this is a way I could get out of this. Just exit the situation. And I didn't want to live in fear of having my computer seized. I didn't want to live in fear of having to go to jail on a contempt of court charge if they tried to compel me to decrypt my computer. When they came to me and said, you know, Steve wants to talk to you, that seemed reasonable.
They offered Norton what is known as a Queen for a Day letter, or a proffer. It allowed prosecutors to ask questions about Aaron's case. Norton would be given immunity from prosecution herself for any information she revealed during the meeting.
I didn't like it. I told my lawyers repeatedly that this seemed fishy. I didn't like this. I didn't want immunity. I didn't need immunity. I hadn't done anything. But they were really, really stringent that they did not want me meeting the prosecutor without immunity.
But just to be clear, this is a Queen for a Day deal, a proffer.
Right, a proffer letter.
In which you basically handed information over to them in exchange for protection from prosecution.
So it wasn't handing information over. It was, at least that's not how I saw it. It was just having a discussion, having an interview with them.
Well, they're asking you questions.
They're asking me
and
questions.
They can ask about whatever they want.
Right.
And whatever they learn,
I really, right. And I repeatedly tried to go in naked. I repeatedly tried to turn down the proffer letter. I was ill. I was being pressured by my lawyers. I was confused. I was not doing well by this point. I was depressed and I was scared and I didn't understand the situation I was in. I had no idea why I was in this situation. I hadn't done anything interesting, much less wrong.
We went out of our minds. Aaron was clearly very distraught about it. We were very distraught about it. Aaron's attorneys were very distraught about it. We tried to get Quinn to change attorneys.
I was very unused to being in a room with large men, well-armed, that are continually telling me I'm lying and that I must have done something. I told them that this thing that they were prosecuting wasn't a crime. I told them that they were on the wrong side of history. I used that phrase. I said, you're on the wrong side of history. And they looked bored. They didn't even look angry. They just looked bored. And it began to occur to me that we weren't having the same conversation. I mean, I told them plenty of things about, why people would download journal articles. And eventually, I don't remember what was around it. I mentioned that he'd done this blog post, the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto.
This is the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto, supposedly written in July 2008 in Italy. Information is power, but like all power, there are those who want to keep it for themselves. The world's entire scientific and cultural heritage, published over centuries in books and journals, is increasingly being digitized and locked up by a handful of private corporations. Meanwhile, those who have been locked out are not standing idly by. You've been sneaking through holes and climbing over fences, liberating the information locked up by the publishers and sharing them with your friends. But all this action goes on in the dark, hidden underground. It's called stealing or piracy, as if sharing a wealth of knowledge were the moral equivalent of plundering a ship and murdering its crew. But sharing isn't immoral, it's a moral imperative. Only those blinded by greed would refuse to let a friend make a copy. There's no justice in following unjust laws. It's time to come into the light and, in the grand tradition of civil disobedience, declare our opposition to this private theft of public culture.
The manifesto itself was allegedly written by 4 different people and also edited by Norton, but it was Swartz who had signed his name to it.
When it's over, I go immediately to Aaron and tell him everything I can remember about it. And he gets very angry. The things that I'd done shouldn't have added up that way. I hadn't done anything wrong, and everything had gone wrong. But I was never... I'm still angry. I'm still angry that you can try your best with these people to do the right thing, and they will turn everything against you, and they will hurt you with anything they can. And in that moment, I regret that I said what I did. But my much larger regret is that we have settled for this, that we are okay with this. That we are okay with a justice system that tries to game people into little traps so they can ruin their lives. So yeah, I wish I hadn't said that, but I am much, much angrier that this is where I am. That this is what we as a people think is okay.
They used every method that I think they could think of to get her to provide information which would be unhelpful to Aaron and helpful to the prosecution of Aaron. Right. But I don't think she had information that was helpful to the government.
Months go by as Swartz's friends and family await a looming indictment. In the meantime, Swartz was becoming a go-to expert on a series of internet issues.
To you then, do you think that the internet is something that should be considered a human right and something that the government cannot take away from you?
Yes, definitely. I mean, this notion that national security is an excuse to shut down the internet, that's exactly what we heard in Egypt and Syria and all these other countries. And so, yeah, it's true. Sites like WikiLeaks are going to be putting up some embarrassing material about what the U.S. government does, and people are going to be organizing to protest about it and try and change their government. And that's a good thing. That's what all these First Amendment rights of free expression, of freedom of association are all about. And so the notion that we should try and shut those down, I think, just goes against very basic American principles. The principle, I think, is one that our founding fathers would have understood. If the internet had been around back then, instead of putting post offices in the Constitution, they would have put ISPs.
Well, it's definitely interesting to see how...
Swartz meets activist Taryn Steinbrickner Kaufman, and the two begin to date.
We need a massive global public outcry.
If there's no massive global public outcry, it won't create any change.
You know, 4 people in this city should cause a massive global public outcry.
You know, we need a petition signer.
Without telling her specifics, he warned her he was involved in something he called simply the bad thing.
And I had sort of crazy theories, like that he was having an affair with Elizabeth Warren or something. I speculated both Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren, actually. But so sometime in probably late July, Aaron called me, and I happened to pick up, and he said, you know, the bad thing might be in the news tomorrow. Do you want me to tell you, or do you want to read about it in the news? And I said, well, I want you to tell me. And he said, well, I've been arrested for downloading too many academic journal articles, and they want to make an example out of me. And I was like, that's it? That's the big fuss? Really? Like, this doesn't sound like a very big deal.
On July 14th, 2011, federal prosecutors indict Swartz on 4 felony counts.
He gets indicted on the same day that like 2 people in England who are part of LulzSec get arrested, and like a few other real hackers. And Aaron is just like someone who kind of looks like a hacker, enough that they can like, you know, put his head on a stake and like put it on the gates.
Aaron went to surrender and they arrested him. They then strip searched him, took away his shoelaces, took away his belt, and left him in solitary confinement.
The District of Massachusetts United States Attorney's Office released a statement saying Swartz faces up to 35 years in prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release, restitution, forfeiture, and a fine of up to $1 million. He is released on $100,000 bail. The same day, the primary victim in the case, JSTOR, formally drops all charges against Swartz and declines to pursue the case.
JSTOR, they weren't our friends, they weren't helpful or friendly to us, but they also were just kind of like, we're not part of this.
JSTOR and their parent company, Ithaca, also sidestepped requests to talk with this film. But at the time, they released a statement saying it was the government's decision whether to prosecute, not JSTOR's.
And so it's our belief that with that, the case will be over. That we should be able to get Steve Hyman to drop the case or settle it in some rational way. And the government refused.
Why?
Well, because I think they wanted to make an example out of Aaron. And they said they wanted to, the reason why they wouldn't move on requiring a felony conviction and jail time was that they wanted to use this case as a case of for deterrence. They told us that.
They told you that?
Yes.
This was going to be an example?
Yes.
He was going to be an example?
Yes. Steve Hyman said that.
Deterring who? Like, there's other people out there running around logging onto JSTOR and downloading the articles to make a political statement? I mean, who are they deterring?
It would be easier to understand the Obama administration's posture of supposedly being for deterrence if this was an administration that, for instance, prosecuted arguably the biggest economic crime that this country has seen in the last 100 years, the crimes that were committed that led to the financial crisis on Wall Street. When you start deploying the non-controversial idea of deterrence only selectively, you stop making a dispassionate analysis of lawbreaking, and you started deciding to deploy law enforcement resources specifically on the basis of political ideology. And that's not just undemocratic, it's supposed to be un-American.
Prosecutor Stephen Hyman later reportedly told MIT's outside counsel that the straw that broke the camel's back was a press release sent out by an organization Swartz founded called Demand Progress. According to the MIT account, Hyman reacted to the short statement of support, calling it a wild internet campaign and a foolish move that moved the case from a human one-on-one level to an institutional level.
That was a poisonous combination. A prosecutor who didn't want to lose face, who had a political career in the offing maybe, and didn't want to have this come back and haunt them. You spent how many tax dollars arresting someone for taking too many books out of the library and they got your ass handed to you in court? No way.
You know, they put incredible pressure on him, took away his, all of the money he had made. They, threaten to take away his physical freedom. Why'd they do it? I mean, well, why are they going after whistleblowers? Why are they going after people who tell the truth about all sorts of things? I mean, from the banks to the, to war, to just sort of government transparency.
So secrecy serves those who are already in power. And we are living in an era of secrecy that coincides with an era where the government is doing also a lot of things that are probably illegal and unconstitutional. So those two things are not coincidences.
It's very clear that this technology has been developed not for small countries overseas, but right here for use in the United States by the U.S. government. The problem with the spying program is it's this sort of long, slow expansion, going back to the Nixon administration, right? Obviously, it became big after 9/11 under George W. Bush, and Obama has continued to expand it, and the problems have slowly grown worse and worse. But there's never been this moment you can point to, say, okay, we need to galvanize opposition today because today is when it matters. Instead, it's mattered for.
The prosecution, in my estimation, of Aaron Swartz was about sending a particular laser-like message to a group of people that the Obama administration sees as politically threatening. And that is essentially the hacker, the information, and the democracy activist community. And the message that the Obama administration wanted to send to that particular community was, in my estimation, we know you have the ability to make trouble for the establishment. And so we are going to try to make an example out of Aaron Swartz to scare as many of you as possible into not making that trouble.
And the government said, oh, the legal opinions we're using to legalize the spying program are also classified. So we can't even tell you which laws we're using to spy on you. Every time they can say, oh, this is another instance of cyber war, the cyber criminals are attacking us again, we're all in danger, we're all under threat. They use those as excuses to push through more and more dangerous laws.
And so just to follow that up, personally, how do you feel the fight is going, I guess?
It's up to you.
I know, but we gotta
There's sort of these two polarizing perspectives, right? Everything is great. The internet has created all this freedom and liberty and everything's going to be fantastic. Or everything is terrible. The internet has created all these tools for cracking down and spying and, controlling what we say. And I think both are true, right? The internet has done both. And both are kind of amazing and astonishing. And which one will win out in the long run is up to us. It doesn't make sense to say, oh, one is doing better than the other. They're both true. And it's up to us which ones we emphasize and which ones we take advantage of, because they're both there and they're both always going to be there.
On September 12, 2012, federal prosecutors filed a superseding indictment against Swartz, adding additional counts of wire fraud, unauthorized access to a computer, and computer fraud. Now, instead of 4 felony counts, Swartz was facing 13. The prosecution's leverage had dramatically increased, as did Swartz's potential jail time and fines.
They filed a separate indictment to add more charges, and they had a theory about why this conduct constituted a number of federal crimes, and that a very significant sentence could attach to it under the law.
That theory, and much of the prosecution's case against Swartz, involved a law created originally in 1986. It is called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was inspired by the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick, which is a great movie.
I have you now.
In this movie, a kid gets the ability through the magic of computer networks to launch a nuclear attack. That's not actually possible, and it certainly wasn't possible in the 80s, but apparently this movie scared Congress enough to pass the original Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
This is a law that's just behind the times. For example, that penalizes terms of service kinds of arrangements. You can have something like eHarmony or Match.com, and somebody sort of inflates their own personal characteristics, and all of a sudden, depending on the jurisdiction and the prosecutors, they could be in a whole host of troubles.
We all know what terms of use are. Most people don't read them, but not abiding by their terms could mean you are committing a felony.
The website terms of service often say things like, be nice to each other, or don't do anything that's improper. The idea that the criminal law has anything to say about these kinds of violations, I think strikes most people as crazy.
The examples get even more crazy. Until it was changed in March of 2013, the terms of use on the website of Hearst's 17 magazine said you had to be 18 in order to read it.
I would say that the way the CFA has been interpreted by the Justice Department, we are probably all breaking the law.
Vague and prone to misuse, the CFAA has become a one-size-fits-all hammer for a wide range of computer-related disputes. Though not the only factor in his case, 11 of the 13 charges against Swartz involved the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The question why hangs over much of the story of Aaron Swartz. Just what was motivating the government, and what would their case have been? The Department of Justice declined requests for answers, but Professor Oren Kerr is a former prosecutor who has studied the case.
So I think I come about this case from a different direction than other people on a number of reasons. I was a federal prosecutor at the Justice Department for 3 years before I started teaching. The government came forward with an indictment based on what crimes they thought were committed, just as a purely lawyers matter, looking at the precedents, looking at the statute, looking at the history, looking at the cases that are out there so far. I think it was a fair indictment based on that. You can debate whether they should have charged this case. There's just a lot of disagreement. Some people are on the open access side, some people are not. I think the government took Swartz's guerrilla open access manifesto very seriously. And I think they saw him as somebody who was committed as a moral imperative to breaking the law to overcome a law that Swartz saw as unjust. And in a democracy, if you think a law is unjust, there are ways of changing that law. There's going to Congress, as Swartz did so masterfully with SOPA. Or you can violate that law in a way to try to nullify that law. And I think what was driving the prosecution was the sense that Swartz was committed not just to breaking the law, but to really making sure that law was nullified, that everyone would have access to the database in a way that you couldn't put the toothpaste back into the tube. It would be done, and Swartz's side would win. There's a big disagreement in society as to whether that is an unjust law, and ultimately that's a decision for the American people to make, working through Congress. And then the second problem is, I think, we're still trying to figure out what's the line between less serious offenses and more serious offenses. We're now entering this different environment of computers and computer misuse, and we don't yet have a really strong sense of exactly what these lines are. So we're just working that out.
This is a poor use of prosecutorial discretion. The hammer that the Justice Department has to scare people with it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so most people just, you can't roll the dice with your life like that.
Should we tap somebody's phone? Should we film them? Should we turn somebody and get them to testify against these other people? That's how federal agents and prosecutors think. They build cases, they make cases.
Swartz was caught in the gears of a brutal criminal justice system that could not turn back, a machine that has made America the country with the highest rate of incarceration in the world.
We have in this country allowed ourselves to be captured by the politics of fear and anger, and anything we're afraid of, like the future of the internet and access, and anything we're angry about instinctively creates a criminal justice intervention. And we've used jail, prison, and punishment to resolve a whole host of problems that historically were never seen as criminal justice problems. The impulse to threaten, indict, prosecute, which is part of what has created this debate and controversy over online access and information on the internet, is very consistent with what we've seen in other areas. The one difference is that the people who are usually targeted and victimized by these kinds of criminal and carceral responses are typically poor and minority.
Swartz's isolation from friends and family increased.
He had basically stopped working on anything else, and the case was, in fact, taking over sort of his whole life.
One of Aaron's lawyers apparently told the prosecutors that he was emotionally vulnerable, and that was something that they really needed to keep in mind so that they knew that.
It was weighing on him very heavily. He did not like having his actions and his movements restricted in any way. And the threat of jail, which they pounded him with a lot, was terrifying to him.
Completely exhausted his financial resources, and it cost us a lot of money also, and he raised a substantial amount of money. So it was, you know, it was in the millions of dollars.
The legal defense
Yes,
was in millions.
yes.
Yeah, I think he didn't want to be a burden to people. I think that was a factor. Like, I have my normal life, and then I have this shitty thing I have to deal with. And I try to like keep the two of them as separate as possible. But they were just beginning to blur together and everything was becoming shitty.
Swartz faced a tough choice that was only getting tougher. Do you admit guilt and move on with your life, or do you fight a broken system? With his legal case, the answer was simple. He rejects the final plea deal, and a trial date is set.
Aaron was resolute that he didn't want to knuckle under and accept something that he didn't believe was fair, but I also think he was scared.
Police say 26-year-old Aaron Swartz killed himself yesterday in his Brooklyn apartment.
I just thought, we've lost one of the most creative minds of our generation. It was like the whole world fell apart in that moment. It was one of the hardest nights of my life.
So I kept screaming, I can't hear you. What did you say? I can't hear you. I can't, that's it.
Like, yeah, none of it made any sense. And really still doesn't.
I was so frustrated, angry. You know, I tried to explain it to my kids. My 3-year-old told me that the doctors would fix him. I've known lots of people who've died, but I've never lost anybody like this. Because everybody feels, and I do too, there's so much we could have more to do. Like, I just didn't know he was there. I didn't know this was what he was suffering, and
he was part of me. And I just wanted it to not be real. And then I just looked at his Wikipedia page and I saw the end date. To 2013.
Aaron is dead. Wanderers in this crazy world, we have lost a mentor, a wise elder. Hackers for right, we're one down. We've lost one of our own. Nurturers, carers, listeners, feeders, parents, all, we have lost a child. Let us all weep.
my first thought was, well, what if nobody even notices? You know, because it wasn't clear to me how salient he was.
I had never seen anything quite like the outpouring I saw.
The net just lit up.
I mean, everyone was trying to explain it in their own way, but I've never seen people grieve on Twitter before. People were visibly grieving online.
He was the internet's own boy. And the old world killed him.
We are standing in the middle of a time when great injustice is not touched. Architects of the financial meltdown have dinner with the president regularly. In the middle of that time, the idea that this was what the government had to prosecute just seems absurd if it weren't tragic.
The question is, can we do something, given what's happened, to make the world a better place? And how can we further that legacy? That's the only question one can ask.
All over the world, there were starting to be hackathons, gatherings. Aaron Swartz has, in some sense, brought the best out of us in trying to say, how do we fix this?
He was, in my humble opinion, one of the true extraordinary revolutionaries that this country has produced.
I don't know whether Aaron was defeated or victorious, but we are certainly shaped by the hand of the things that he wrestled with.
When we turn armed agents of the law on citizens trying to increase access to knowledge, we've broken the rule of law, we've desecrated the temple of justice. Aaron Swartz was not a criminal. Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, it comes through continuous struggle.
Aaron really could do magic. And I'm dedicated to making sure that his magic doesn't end with his death. He believed that he could change the world, and he was right. Out of the last week and out of today, phoenixes are already rising.
Since Swartz's death, Representative Zoe Lofgren and Senator Ron Wyden have introduced legislation that would reform the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the outdated law that formed the majority of the charges against Swartz. It's called Aaron's Law.
Aaron believed that, you literally ought to be asking yourself all of the time, what is the most important thing I could be working on in the world right now? And if you're not working on that, why aren't you?
This is what democracy looks like. We are people. Internet freedom is under attack. What do we do? Stand up like that. Internet freedom is under attack. What do we do? Hey, hey. Go home. Our Northeast has got to go. Hey, hey.
I wish we could change the past, but we cannot. But we can change the future, and we must. We must do so for Aaron. We must do so for ourselves. We must do so to make our world a better place, a more humane place, a place where justice works and access to knowledge becomes a human right.
So there was a kid back in February from Baltimore, 14 years old, who had access to JSTOR. And he'd been spelunking through JSTOR after reading something. And he figured out a way to do early tests for pancreatic cancer. And pancreatic cancer kills the shit out of you because we detect it way too late. By the time we detect it, it's already too late to do anything about it. He sent emails off to the entire oncology department at Johns Hopkins, hundreds of them. And every 14-year-old kid, yeah. And most of them ignored it, right? But one of them sent him an email back and said, this is not an entirely stupid idea. Why don't you come on over? And this kid worked evenings and weekends with this researcher. And in February, I heard him on the news, just a couple of weeks after Aaron died, when Aaron was in the news a lot. Sorry. And he said the reason he was on the news is because they'd done it. They were shipping an early test for pancreatic cancer that was going to save lives. And he said, this is why what Aaron did was so important. Because you never know, right? This truth of the universe is not only something that policymakers use to figure out, what the speed limit should be. It's where the thing that's going to keep, your kid from dying of pancreatic cancer comes from. And without access, the person who might come up with the thing that's got your number on it may never find that answer.
He slept so well, he didn't fall out of bed once, not even when he dreamed he was back on the spacecraft.
Very good, Aaron. Very good. Yay, Aaron.
Okay. Now